Hello students, today I am going to talk to you about one of the grand theories of development, the psychosexual theory of development by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was a grand figure. He is considered one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. Sigmund Freud has given to psychology not only a theory of development, but a theory of personality as well, in which he describes not only what the changes are that takes place in the individual right up from the time of birth to the time of adolescence, but he also tries to explain why these changes take place. Freud thought that consciousness was like an iceberg. He divided the consciousness into 3 levels, and he said that the conscious awareness, what we call consciousness, is only 1/10 of the iceberg which is visible. The next level is the subconscious or the preconscious as he called it, and the last was the unconscious. The conscious is a very small part of the mind, and it includes everything which we are aware of at a given time. The preconscious contains material just beneath the surface of awareness that can easily be retrieved whenever you need it. It holds memories that the conscious needs in order to perform its functions. So, for example, if I ask you to remember or to recall what you ate yesterday for breakfast, you would delve into your preconscious and bring that material into your conscious, and you would tell me. The largest part of the consciousness is what Freud talked about extensively, and that is the unconscious. This unconscious contains thoughts, memories and desires that are well below the surface of conscious awareness, but nonetheless they exert a great influence on our behavior. It is a storehouse of unacceptable images. Within this unconscious are instinctual elements that we are totally unaware of. Freud believed that human beings are driven by their instincts and that we have nothing much we can do about them. He talked about 2 instincts, thanatos, which he called the death instinct, and eros, which he called the life instinct. In all human beings, both these instincts are present, and most of the time eros dominates over the thanatos. He believes that all human beings are hedonistic and pleasure seeking and are dominated by their life instinct. At some periods of time, the death instincts come to the fore and we indulge in destructive behavior. And he also believed that this was the case when countries went to war, that the death instinct predominated over the life instinct. Both these instincts are fueled by psychic energy, which he called the libido. Freud gave to us a structure of the personality. He also spoke about the interaction of these 3 structures of personality, which he called personality dynamics, and he outlined a series of stages during which the personality develops. So, first now we will look at the structure of personality. Now, this structure does not physically exist in anybody. These are hypothetical constructs, and he said that it consisted of 3 parts. The first is known as the id, the second is the ego, and the third is the superego. The id is what we are born with, and it is totally unconscious, and in the beginning this is all that exists. There is no ego, there is no superego. So, the newborn infant is all id. It works on the pleasure principle and demands instant gratification for all its bodily needs, that is most primarily hunger and thirst. So, if the baby is very hungry, immediately it wants gratification or thirsty. Always the id tries to avoid pain and seek pleasure, and to do this it uses the primary process through dreams and fantasies. It satisfies its needs through dreams and fantasies. This is the seat of the libido, which is the psychic energy. The ego is known as the executive of personality. It works on the reality principle. It emerges from the id and it uses the secondary process. The ego is always working between the id and the superego. And for the ego, the most difficult task is controlling the id urges. Remember that the id always wants instant gratification. The ego is present at all three levels of consciousness, that is the conscious level, the preconscious level as well as the unconscious level. The superego is that part of the personality into which is incorporated the social standards of our society and ideas about what is right and wrong. It always believes in doing the right thing. It achieves perfection as defined by the moral code. The superego has two components, the conscience and the ego ideal. When we do something which is considered right by our society, by our parents and by the people around us, it is the ego ideal which makes you experience pride. And when you do something wrong, you always, I think, hear a little voice telling you that you are doing wrong. That is your conscience, and it makes you experience guilt. And the development of this little voice is very, very important in the development of the personality. The superego develops around the age of 5 or 6. So, in the first 5 years of life, as Freud believed, these experiences which a child has are very important, and the total structure of the personality is in place by the time the child is 5. So, the kind of experiences which the child has are very important. He stresses on the early experiences in a child's life. Now, the three structures of the personality are constantly interacting with each other. The superego also exists at all the three different levels of consciousness, and they are constantly interacting with each other. And this interaction is what causes problems. Freud outlined the consequences of this interaction in what he called the personality dynamics. These interactions often give rise to conflict, because we have the id on one hand, which is constantly demanding immediate gratification, and on the other hand we have the superego, which is saying no, you cannot do this, or you cannot do this, you should do this, and in between is the ego. He wants to please the id as well as the superego, and because the ego is the executor of the personality. Whatever action has to be taken, whatever behavior is a result, is decided by the ego, and the ego takes the reality into consideration whenever it is executing a particular behavior. So, this conflict, most of the time the ego is able to handle the conflict between the two and is able to come to some resolution of the conflict, but sometimes it is not able to resolve the conflict. This causes anxiety, and whenever a human being is anxious, according to Freud, who believed that we are hedonistic, pleasure seeking, we try to reduce this conflict because we are in an uncomfortable state of being. So, when the ego is not able to resolve this conflict and experiences anxiety, it uses a kind of a shield to protect itself from harm of the anxiety, and this is known as defense mechanisms. He uses, these are certain mechanisms which all of us use, which protect us from anxiety. He outlined the defense mechanisms in detail. These are means by which individuals rechannel or redirect inhibited libidinal impulses, that is mostly by the id, the urges which the id has, which is fueled by the libido. The defense mechanisms operate at an unconscious level. We are not even aware that we are using these defense mechanisms. What they do is, they take the reality, distort it a bit, and they employ that, and we use. For example, when you are disappointed, we often use what is known as rationalization. That is a defense mechanism which is operating at an unconscious level. All normal human beings use defense mechanisms. It is only when we continue to use them in the place of normal thinking processes that it becomes a problem. Some of the defense mechanisms outlined by Freud are repression, sublimation, displacement, identification, projection, regression and reaction formation. Freud also outlined 5 stages of psychosexual development, which are crucial in the formation of the adult personality. In these stages of development, the libido, which is the psychic energy, is concentrated in different parts of the body. And this during these stages, there is always a conflict. In Freud's theory, there is always a conflict. So, there is a conflict at every stage which has to be resolved by the child, and the different ways of resolving this conflict gives rise to different kinds of personality. Now, the conflict which is there, the need which is there in the child may be over gratified or under gratified at a particular stage. Now, if this happens, the child gets fixated, as he uses the term fixated. Fixation is where you are stuck at a particular stage of development. It does not mean that you do not go on to the next stage of development, but the effects of that particular fixation are obvious in your adult personality in some way or the other. Now, we will look at the stages. There are 5 stages of development. The first is the oral stage. We then have the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latent stage and the genital stage. Freud believed that development, the majority of the development or almost all of development was completed by the time a child is say 18 or 20. We will now look at the stages in detail. The first stage is the oral stage, which is crucial in the formation of the adult personality. In this stage, the libido is concentrated around the mouth and pleasure is received from eating, sucking and biting, all activities centered around the mouth. Fixation at this stage, that means if you are either over gratified, that means you are indulged in a lot of oral activities, or if you are under gratified, that is when you are not given enough opportunities to satisfy your oral needs, then you become fixated at this stage. This leads to what is known as an oral personality, a person who either passively receives help from others or one who needs to abuse others. That is, you want to be sarcastic, like for example, we say whenever a person is sarcastic, we say biting sarcasm. All that is a legacy of Freud, all these terms. And the key task at this stage is weaning, and that is the area of conflict in the oral stage of development. So, this is the effect of that fixation at that stage. The next stage is the anal stage, which again is crucial in the formation of the adult personality. At this stage, the arena of conflict is toilet training, and the child takes great pleasure in defecation. Fixation at this stage occurs when there is again over gratification or under gratification. It depends on the toilet training practices used by the person who is looking after the child. If the parent is too harsh or too lenient, it can lead to 2 different kinds of personalities. One is the anal retentive personality and the other is the anal expulsive personality. Now, the anal retentive personality will be a person who is who's a perfectionist, who's very rigid, okay? And the anal expulsive is one who is sloppy, messy. These are the 2 kinds of personalities which result if you have a fixation at this particular stage. Now, we come to the third stage, which is one of the most controversial parts of Freud's theory, which is the phallic stage, which is when we have what is famously known as the Oedipus complex, which is experienced by the male child. In the Oedipus complex, the male child supposedly is sexually attracted to the parent of the opposite sex, that is to the mother. He resents the father, he is jealous of the father and he wants his mother all to himself. but at the same time he fears his father, that if his father comes to know that he likes his mother, he will castrate him. So, he experiences castration anxiety. Once he realizes this, he gives up his longings for his mother and identifies with his father. Now, the process of identification is a very big milestone in a child's life. It is if identification occurs with the parent of the same sex, the superego comes into place, and it is a very crucial milestone in the development of the superego. The resolution of, as we said, the conflict leads to the development of a strong superego. If it is not resolved, then the superego is either weak or absent, and if unresolved, according to Freud and some theorists, the male is likely to become homosexual or end up not really liking women. A similar kind of complex exists in the girl child, that is the Electra complex. The girls love their mother, but feel that their organs are inferior, and they resent the mother for producing this defect. They feel that it is a defect, and that is what Freud says, that they do not really totally identify with the mother, and that is why he says that the girl child never really develops a strong ego. This unresolved complex, if it is unresolved, may again lead to homosexual tendencies or to other kinds of problems. The key task here is identifying with the adult role model. That is how a child learns how to behave like a male or how to behave like a female, and coping with the Oedipal crisis. The children now enter into the latency period, where they lose interest in anything sexual. They are more interested in own sex play group, and the key task here is, they are in school now, and the key task is expanding social concerns, and the sexual instincts are all latent, as the period suggests. The fifth and last stage of development, as outlined by Freud, is the genital stage, in which there is a resurgence of the libido, and in this the child reacts to a person of the opposite sex with desire and affection. At this stage, you develop genuine friendships, love and social attachments. According to Freud, many people never reach this stage as they fail to resolve the earlier conflicts. The key task here is establishing intimate relationships and contributing to society through working. This is the end of the adolescent stage, when you are about to enter young adulthood. Freud's contributions are legion, and there are many people who believe that Freud is wrong in today's context, but there is no doubting that he played a very, very important role in the development of the field of psychology. We will now just briefly look at the contributions made by Freud. He highlighted the role of early experience in development. He focused on the family as a central aspect of development, the role of the family. And one of the most important contributions of Freud was his attention to the unconscious aspects of the mind. Nobody had clearly outlined the unconscious as he did. And most important for developmental psychology was that he provided a comprehensive framework for understanding development, not only how it happens, but why it happens. Many criticisms are there for Freud's theory, and the main criticism is that all his concepts are very difficult to test scientifically, and psychology is a science. It has to be demonstrated scientifically, and many of his concepts are not amenable to scientific research. Data which supports his theory come from individual reconstruction of the past. So, it is very subjective, very questionable, and we do not know whether they are really accurate experiences which they are reporting the people. The sexual underpinnings of development are given too much importance. This is also one of the very much debated about Freud's theory, about his emphasis on the sexual nature of the developing child. He also presents a negative view of human beings as people who are totally controlled by their instincts and who do not have much of a role to play in their own development. Of course, another criticism is that Freud had a very negative view of women. His theory is culture biased and gender biased, because what he speaks about may be true only of certain cultures, and he believed, he never spoke much about the development of women. He considered them inferior to males. But looking at the criticism, and today the trend is that Freud is all wrong, but there is no doubt that for his time he was a giant in his times. His theory is a grand theory of development and offers a powerful framework for interpreting and understanding change and development. His work had a profound influence on a number of fields, including psychology, sociology, anthropology, literature and art. Developmentalists owe a debt of gratitude to this extraordinary intellectual leader for his insightful, stimulating and provocative theory of human development.
Ma'am, I would like to ask, why is Freud's theory so controversial in today's times?
There are two aspects of Freud's theories which are very controversial. One is that his emphasis on the sexual nature of the child. People find it hard to believe that a 5-year-old child can go through either the Oedipal or the Electra complex. But people who have been practicing as psychiatrists and counselors say that they can see the evidence of this in the clients which come to them. He brought out his theory during the Victorian age, where the very concept of sexuality was a very repressed notion, and therefore it is controversial. And another aspect of Freud's theory which is controversial is his view about women, which is very negative, and that's why maybe people like to run him down.
Does every time ego reaches a decision making when there is a conflict between id and superego?
Id and the superego are always making demands of the ego, and the ego is a slave of both the id and the superego. It wants to please both its masters, and it tries its best, taking reality into account, to come to a certain conclusion or to come to a certain way of behavior which can satisfy both the id and the superego, though it is a very difficult task. And most of the time the ego is successful, but at times it is impossible, and that is the time when it makes use of the defense mechanisms and employs these defense mechanisms to please both the ego and the id and the superego. So, most of the time it is able to satisfy both the masters. Whenever there is a conflict between the three structures of the personality and the ego is not able to resolve the conflict in a proper manner, it resorts to the use of defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms were outlined by Freud and later by his daughter Anna Freud, and these defense mechanisms operate at an unconscious level, so that we are not even aware that we are using them. These are means by which an individual rechannels or redirects his inhibited libidinal impulses. For example, many times we have urges which we want to satisfy, but we are not able to because of taboos or because of certain restrictions by our society. But the urge has to be satisfied. The superego says no, it says right now, and the ego is unable to deal with it. It sometimes is able to, but sometimes is not able to. At this time, the ego feels threatened. It develops anxiety, and this is an uncomfortable state of affairs. And so, to reduce that anxiety, the ego makes use of these defense mechanisms. What the defense mechanisms do is that they distort the reality in such a way that the ego is able to reduce the tension which it is experiencing. Now, let us look at some of these defense mechanisms. The most basic defense mechanism as outlined by Freud was repression. Now, repression involves pushing away all that is unacceptable. It could be your desires, it could be your wants, it could be your fantasies, or it could be feelings of shame, fear, embarrassment, all which are negative, which make you feel unpleasant. We are not able to deal with these things. We push them deep into the unconscious. So, this is the basic defense mechanism. We push them into the unconscious. Now, what happens in the unconscious? We feel that by pushing them into the unconscious, because we do not want to remember those events or those feelings, we have done away with them, but that does not happen. The unacceptable wishes which are in the unconscious seek some release, and they show up in some other forms of behavior for which we can never give an explanation. So, if you behave in a particular way and you sometimes wonder, why did I behave like this? Most of our behavior we can explain. You went to college because you have a reason. You went out with your friends because you wanted to spend time with them and have some fun. But there are some times when we behave in strange ways for which we have no explanation, and you may lash out at somebody and then you say, why did I do that? This is the working of the unconscious which is coming to the fore. So, he outlined several other defense mechanisms. One of them is projection, that is, when you project outward whatever you are feeling which is not considered right or which is not good, you project it onto another person. Like for example, if you hate somebody, okay, then you will project it onto somebody whom you hate and you say he hates me, that is projection. Then we have regression, when you go back to an earlier state of development, like you start behaving like a young child, you throw a temper tantrum. You have seen adults throwing temper tantrums, that is regression, or you start crying, which is a childhood behavior. Then we have rationalization, which is also very common. Whenever we feel that we have, suppose for example, you have not done well in your exam and your ego is not able to accept it because you are good at studies, but you have failed. Your ego is not able to accept that. So, you try to develop a reason for it by saying that I had so many guests at home and I could not study, or that my teacher has marked me in some strange way, I do not know why. You develop a reason, that is called rationalization. Now, these are different defense mechanisms which allay the anxiety which the ego feels and gives you time to come to terms with whatever is happening. Like for example, in denial, when somebody dies, you feel grief, you are not able to cope with it. So, for some time you use the defense mechanism of denial. You may refuse to believe that the person is dead. So, if it gives you time to come to terms with whatever is happening, but if you continue to be in a state of denial for say 1 or 2 years, then it becomes maladjustive. So, defense mechanisms are used by every normal person also, which gives us time to come to terms with whatever we are experiencing, unpleasant feelings or thoughts. But if we continue to use them, that is indicative of a maladjusted person.